What if I told you that Soaring Blade changes recently aren't actually a nerf? What if I was actually telling you that they were a buff? What's up guys, Kurno here, and welcome back to another PSO2 video. So today we're going to talk about the recent changes that have popped up after the maintenance on November 10th, 2021. Real quick before we jump into that guys, if you're new to the channel, I'm Kurno, I do content over here on YouTube daily. Would much appreciate a subscribe as we work our way towards our 10K mark. I wanted to make it by the end of the year, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. This afternoon, we finally got our hands on Bouncer again. And recently they did have a bit of a change. Now, if you're kind of curious as to what brought about this change or what exactly needed to be changed, I'm going to link a video in the video description showing off the video where I show what Soaring Blades actually could do as a multi-weapon for a weapon like Twin Daggers. It was pretty bananas, but the long story short was you were able to push out extra damage by using a glide cancel to get out Photon Blades in the middle of your Twin Dagger PAs during Photon Blade Fever, or I guess it's called Fanatic Blade, technically. Listen, I'm probably going to make that mistake a few times in this video and probably will for a while until I break my habit of saying Photon Blade Fever, but yes, I'm talking about Fanatic Blade. Anyway, with this crazy glide cancel and use of pretty interesting game mechanics, you were able to push out an insane close to 710 DPS with a Twin Dagger and Soaring Blade multi-weapon pretty much every time Fanatic Blade was up and the target was sitting still. Now, this is a problem for two reasons. One, it made fighters insanely powerful, and two, it took my favorite weapon and reduced it to a support weapon for another weapon for a different class. Now, anyone who actually wanted to play Soaring Blades knows that this needed to be changed. It was way too strong, it was way too powerful. So SEGA addressed that they were going to be making some changes. They said what they were going to be doing, and honestly, when I read the changes at first, I really had the thought that I've come to the conclusion of now. It doesn't really sound like a nerf, it sounds like a buff. Now, there are a couple of things to talk about in between, but we'll get to the ending. I don't want to jump all the way to the end. But fast forward to today, finally get our hands on it, run outside to see what exactly has changed or how things are going to look. And my feelings on it weren't exactly great immediately. Actually, if we're being completely honest, I hated it. I hated it so much. But let me explain what actually changed. So there were a couple of notes of changes. First off, Photon Blades were actually buffed in their damage, roughly by about 3 times. So they went from 30 potency to about 90. While inversely, Fanatic Blade was actually nerfed, going from I believe a 1.2 times multiplier to a 0.4 times multiplier by roughly 1/3. On top of that, any blades that were used as a part of a multi-weapon, while the Soaring Blades are not the primary weapon that's out on your target, are also nerfed in their damage. I believe this is about a 1/4 nerf across the board for this type. Now, if you're curious what I mean, technically you can shoot weapon blades. So if you have your weapon action on your palette, but you're using a multi-weapon that has another weapon type along with Soaring Blades, you would still shoot blades out while you had out the other weapon. Think something like a fighter that would have Knuckles along with a double saber. The double saber whirlwind would still be out in effect even if you're using the fighter PAs. And in those situations, the actual whirlwind is nerfed in damage. I believe this also happens for Talus, if I remember correctly, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. I'll have to actually do a bit more research, but you get the idea. Essentially, while the weapon is not primarily Soaring Blade, then the damage itself was nerfed. And the final change you receive, and probably the one I like the least, is there is now an innate 2-second cooldown whenever you use a active or an attack skill essentially after using a weapon action. So between the cooldown of the next weapon action. Now, if you're kind of curious what I'm talking about, if you actually take your weapon action, put it onto your hotbar, onto your sub palette at the very bottom of your screen, you'll be able to see that every time you weapon action, there's a slight cooldown of when you'll be able to weapon action again afterwards. This cooldown being shorter a little bit, it seems like whenever you're using Photon Blade Fanatic or Blade Fanatic in general. Now, if you use an attack after you use a Photon Blade, that cooldown immediately jumps up to being 2 seconds the moment you use that attack. Now, seeing as Blades got buffed by nearly 3 times the damage while Blade Fanatic isn't active, and then of course they nerfed Blade Fanatic to counter that damage buff too much, because if they didn't, Blade Fanatic would be absolutely insane as far as damage is concerned, but realistically, that got kind of normalized out. That does sort of makes sense. However, there are certain situations where that 2-second timer feels really, really bad. Now, huge disclaimer, I'm going off of feeling, not necessarily damage. On paper, the damage actually doesn't working out to be any less. it works out to being about the same, outside of one very specific situation. Now, whenever you step counter while Fanatic Blade is active, you essentially can't do anything for 2 seconds, or well, essentially you can't get another blade to fly out for 2 seconds after you step counter. The reason I feel like this is so terrible personally is because that was the only active thing you did while Fanatic Blade was going. Realistically, you pretty much just did that. I believe there was also like a cancel you could do with slam attacks as well. I didn't personally get a chance to use that to see if it was how great it actually was. I didn't really hear a whole lot about it. Maybe it was something I was missing as far as things are going, but Fanatic Blade isn't exactly a very exciting cooldown. In most cases, you just kind of used it and then you would step counter damage incoming towards you. Now, because of the change, if you step counter any damage that comes towards you, meaning if you actually do the counter damage, if you just step it, it's fine. But if you actually do the counter attack afterwards, you've got a 2-second timer before blades will fly out again, meaning that you got to do something in the meantime, that way you don't lose out on massive amounts of damage. Now, it works out to be if you actually step counter 2 attacks in a row, it is about average. Like after the second one, you're pretty much good. Your blades will start flying again. But if there's a single attack coming, now realistically what you have to do is step counter and then throw out a PA to take up about a second's worth of time, cancel out of that PA to go back into throwing weapon blades again. Now, while that might not actually be worse as far as damage is concerned, actually I think it might actually be worse. I haven't looked at all the numbers on that specific situation, but just kind of like eyeballing it seems like it might be a bit worse. It does feel incredibly jank to use. And one thing to keep in mind is that, yeah, you could definitely do that, but the average player is really not going to think about doing that. They're just going to step counter and see that they're not throwing any blades out. And it's going to probably look really, really bad or kind of feel really terrible. Well, if we're being perfectly honest, the average player in most situations usually wouldn't even step counter the attack, but that's besides the point. Either way, it feels pretty bad to do. And that was one of the favorite things I liked doing during Photon Blade Fanatic or during Blade Fanatic in general, was still step countering all the damage I took and then getting my blades to go out in between all the other damage, because step countering is still very strong. If you guys had a chance to watch my Bujin solo, that was probably one of the most funs I had with fighting Bujin, was being able to step counter but still getting blades going out. So it almost felt like the most optimal type of damage you possibly could have. It made Photon Blade Fanatic or Blade Fanatic in general feel really good. And that's something that can't really be undersold. The feeling of an ability does matter. It doesn't matter if it's fully balanced. Now, in my opinion, when it comes to developing a game, granted, I'm going to say my opinion because it is just my opinion. You might have a different opinion, that's totally fine. But when it comes to developing a game, there needs to be a balance between something being balanced and something being fun. If the only mindset is on balance and something isn't fun anymore, then realistically, players aren't going to want to always do it. Games just aren't designed for the top 1% of player that's going to go for the absolute most optimal situation all the time. It's designed for the majority. Now, it is important to have a balance between the two, but realistically speaking, as someone who likes to optimize, even I felt like the change didn't feel great, and on first glance of just using it, it felt like a full nerf. Now, granted, again, wrapping things back around, we understand it's a buff, but it just didn't feel good to use. And I feel like that's something that some people sometimes undersell when you're looking at things. It should still feel good to use. While I personally disagreed with all of the with all of the Katana Braver players about, weapon action counter being a stronger option, like it should always be a stronger option, I personally agreed towards balance. The feeling of the weapon action counter for Katana and the class fantasy behind it has always been weapon action counter overall. And I can understand where they're coming from, where I feel like that should be the better choice. Step counter doesn't have to be the better choice. From a perspective of like balancing, step counter is the better choice. You step counter when you're on the ground. If you're in the air, you weapon action counter, or either one of the two. Basically, you want to make sure you're getting the counter off in the ideal situation. But if you can step counter, realistically, you do want to step counter. Now, granted, that's changing in the level 35 patch we'll be getting in December. So hopefully SEGA thinks about these sorts of changes, about things also feeling good as well as them actually being balanced. Because realistically right now, though technically Soaring Blades did get a bit of a buff, there's now more optimization around making sure you always get your blades in between PAs, because now at this point it's basically a free 180 potency that you'd be throwing away if you don't. So if you lose like a free 33 DPS on top of what you normally get, you do have to utilize a lot more cancels. You have to utilize a lot more things that players realistically don't always use. It's great to have those available, but it is still important for something to feel good to use. And I'm telling you right now, honestly, in my opinion, the only change that should have happened is the change with the multi-weapon. Everything else being left the same, I feel like should have been the case. Now, granted, whether or not that's something they could have done from like a back end standpoint, that's up to the developer. I don't know the code of the game itself, and people that are assuming they understand the code of the game where something can be coded or can't be coded, in most cases are completely just throwing out random BS. It's not our job to decide how to fix an issue. It's mostly our job to decide whether there's a problem. That's where the player comes in. It's up to the developer to understand how to fix the problem overall. We can give suggestions, but they need to figure out how to get it taken care of. So in my personal opinion, the issue itself was there. The issue now exists primarily for Fnatic Blade. Fnatic Blade just feels worse overall. Again, it can be optimized around, it can be made to be good, but that downtime, man, like when I first started using it, it just felt so bad. And I can't really explain that any further overall. I hate for this video to be all negative. I know it does come off very negative. I'm not a huge fan of the changes that we got for Soaring Blade's Bouncer. Well, it is still technically a buff, and I do like now the type of optimization you get outside of Fnatic Blade. It's funny because the one problem I had with Soaring Blades was the issue of, aerial parrying or whatever, which we're getting a change going towards in December, and Fnatic Blade feeling boring. And now it feels kind of more boring, and if not boring, it feels kind of jank now instead of boring, which is a very odd change to get. So hopefully we'll see some changes or some, I don't want to say like full backpedal because changes did need to happen for the way Soaring Blades were being used, but I hope it's a different direction. We'll have to see how things go. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think in the comments, how you guys feel with the changes themselves. I do want to let you guys know because it is a common misconception. People think this is a Soaring Blades nerf. Technically speaking, on paper, it is a buff. You can play around the changes and do more damage now than you could do previously, which is very good. But if you don't know what you're doing, the average player is going to do less damage because they don't understand, and it's not as easy to understand overall compared to other classes, and it's going to turn people away from the class. I feel like that's more important than anything else. Anyway, guys, feel free to talk in the comments what you guys think should be changed about the class itself, what you'd like to see moving forward. A real quick one that I did mention in a previous video, but what kind of skills are you guys looking forward to seeing that we could be getting in the December patch? Myself personally, of course, we had the whole video talking about all that stuff, but I'd like to see what you guys think, and I'll be checking out the comments to see that information. Anyway, guys, I could ramble on forever about Soaring Blades. I'm going to cut it here. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care. Peace out.